Hi, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and it's my great honor to introduce tonight's program with Kimberlé Crenshaw, a leading pioneering scholar and writer on civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, race, racism, and the law. She was a founder and has been a leader in the intellectual movement called critical race theory, and is also known for introducing and developing the concept of intersectionality. And she's also one of my greatest heroes of all times. She's the executive director of the African American Policy Forum, which she co-founded in 1996 as a think tank that connects academics, activists, and policymakers to promote efforts to dismantle structural inequality. Crenshaw is not only a distinguished professor of law here at UCLA, but also the Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. Tonight we're going to hear from her new memoir, Backtalker, an American Memoir, which just hit number 14 on the New York Times bestseller list. Yeah. And I think it was also on her birthday, which is fabulous. And the book's only been out for 9 days, so let's send it to number 1. This amazing book uses the story of Crenshaw's own life as a vehicle for something larger, making intersectionality and critical race theory, two of the most debated and misunderstood ideas in American public life, legible through lived experience. From a kindergarten school play to the Anita Hill hearings to the movement against police violence, Crenshaw shows how these frameworks aren't abstractions, they're tools for seeing what others miss and for naming what has too often gone unnamed. She also organizes an amazing annual summer series for education and skills building for people who want to engage deeper in the fight against inequality. This summer, it's called Backtalker Academy, and we have colleagues here from the African American Policy Forum on hand who can answer questions for you and let you know how you can become more involved if you're interested. They're going to be at a table at the reception after the program. Tonight, Professor Crenshaw will be in dialogue with the amazing UC Berkeley law professor, Russell Robinson, who was formerly a law professor here at UCLA, so we welcome him back. Robinson's scholarly and teaching interests include anti-discrimination law, race and sexuality, law and psychology, constitutional law, and media and entertainment law. He graduated with honors from Harvard Law School, clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer of the U.S. Supreme Court and Judge Dorothy Nelson of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and has also worked for the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel, and at the law firm Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. On your way into the theater, you were given a note card and pencil for Q&A. If you have any questions you'd like to share with our guest speakers, please write them legibly on the note card and pass them to our ushers when they come by, and they'll bring them to the stage. And then after tonight's conversation and Q&A, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments outside in the theater lobby, and Professor Crenshaw will also be signing some copies of her new book. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and now please join me in welcoming Kimberlé Crenshaw and Russell Robinson.
Hello. We are so excited to be with you today and to be together, reunited, years after being colleagues at UCLA Law School.
And I just said we don't let them go. Always pulling them back.
Trying to get me back, you know? And I remember, and I felt this in reading your book, that I wanted to be at UCLA because you and Cheryl and Devin made me feel like we would be family, not just colleagues, but family. And I still feel that, even with the distance, I still feel that sense of kinship and chosen family. And so, reading about your biological family and learning about you was a real delight. And I'm so excited to get to have this conversation with you and to invite you all later on to submit questions for our conversation. I'm going to keep it brief so we can hear from the backtalker. But I would just say, in the book Backtalker, which I hope you all will get if you don't have it already, and which was just named a New York Times bestseller, Kim says that, yes, please give her some love. Kim says that ever since she was a child, her mom would praise her by saying, "Baby, you can talk." And that is 100% true, I can tell you. And so you are in for a treat this evening. And yeah, when I think about public intellectuals and people that can captivate a room, there's nobody that matches you. Like, honestly, like when I think about just the sheer pleasure of listening to somebody talk, it's Kimberlé, right? So I'm so humbled and excited to be able to have this conversation with you tonight. I want to give you a little bit of context. I know most of you probably aren't law professors or lawyers, but the thing is, you are here and you know about intersectionality without being in the law, and that's pretty unusual. Most of the time, law professors, we write these articles, and we're lucky if like hundreds of people maybe read them. Maybe a court cites it once every blue moon. They kind of go into the dustbin and you get tenure based on them, but they don't actually make a difference in the world. I'm not supposed to be saying this probably, but I'm keeping it real, right? And then there's intersectionality, right? Which breaks the mold, which, I mean, I have like my niece, right, who's 20 years old, like, and I have friends that are like, wait, you know Kimberlé Crenshaw? Like, you know intersectionality? Like, the way in which this concept has traveled around the world, right? Where people in India and Europe and Jamaica, like people are talking about intersectionality. It's in the New York Times, it's in the Washington Post. Movements, Black Lives Matter movement, maybe most prominently, but many movements, Me Too, are engaging intersectionality. And I've seen, and we'll talk about this later, that the students come in, you know, there are a lot of concepts in critical race theory, but the one that students come in where like before they've even taken law classes they know about and they want to learn more about is intersectionality. And so it really, your contribution is singular in terms of just the broader consciousness and the shift that has happened in terms of people understanding this concept. Most of our ideas as law professors don't escape the academy. They just kind of, we talk to each other and cite each other, but you've changed the world, right? It's true. Yeah. So I'm gonna stop talking. I'm just gonna say a little bit in terms of some of the things that moved me was, and I don't think I realized it, I remembered it until I was reading the book and getting into the sort of your childhood and just all the overlap in terms of, we're from Ohio. And I'm sure you've probably gotten the jokes. People at my undergrad would be like, is that like Iowa, right? You know, so people treat it like this flyover state, you know, but you know what it's like to be Black in Ohio, to be the child of a teacher, to go to a evangelical, predominantly white school. Not fun. There's a lot of overlap that we have. And so I do think like it was meant to be in terms of us uniting at UCLA because our paths overlap. When I'm hearing you talk about your household, so much of it resonated with the household in which I was raised, the Black church, the influence of that, music. There's just so much symmetry. So I'm excited to be in conversation with you. I think we're going to start with a reading of the preface from the book, right?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So great to see you. And I want to start by saying that one of the things that's been so exciting to me about this book tour is that I get a chance to be in conversation with other backtalkers. So if you don't know Russell Robinson yet, you will. You must go read Russell Robinson. Russell talks back to the Supreme Court in line and verse. And we know that's exactly what we need to be doing right now. So thank you, Russell, for coming down and engaging in this conversation with me. So I am going to say that before we get started, there's a confession that I have to make. Being a backtalker is like being lactose intolerant. We just talked about that. There are some things that I cannot digest. To accept anything close to second-class status as the price of belonging sickens me. I learned this the hard way during my very first year at Harvard Law School when I bent and scraped my way into voluntary humiliation. It happened at the Fly Club, the prestigious home of elite Harvard men, including former presidents, captains of industry, and scions of wealthy families. Ben, who was the first African American member of this exclusive club and a study partner, invited me and Reese, the third member of our all black study group, to join him to celebrate the end of our first semester. From what Reese and I had heard about the club's safari decorated interiors and its exclusionary history, we both agreed that in the likely event that something unwelcoming occurred, we were not going to take any shit. Our dignity was a non-negotiable condition of our presence in that space. Duly bonded, we arrived at the venue and knocked at the door to announce our arrival. Ben opened the front door but stepped outside, blocking our entry into the club. Assuming that this was the beginning of the indignities that we were not going to tolerate, Reese and I immediately assumed the trigger position, arms crossed and brows furrowed. Our friend, sensing our readiness to rumble, sought to de-escalate the situation with what he thought was a minor detail. Oh, it's not what you think. I just forgot to mention that Kim needs to go around to the back door, he explained. Women aren't permitted to enter through the front door. Now, in my mind, whether my backdoor treatment was because I was a woman or because I was a black person made no difference in our mutual defense pact. But for Reese, solidarity applied only to things that were going to affect us both in the same way. Presumably, racial exclusion of both of us fit the bill, but the gender exclusion of me did not. Worse still, Reese and Ben plainly expected me not to make a scene. I stood momentarily frozen, both by the realization that they would not stand up for me to be treated as their equal, and by my own fear that they would judge me harshly for insisting that they do. Their plea for me to behave reflected a familiar expectation to pledge allegiance to a flag of solidarity that didn't pledge the same to me. A stronger me might have refused to dance to this unrelentingly asymmetrical tune. But at that point in life, my commitments to the we ran deep, perhaps because there were only so many battles anyone could wage and still feel like she had a home. For whatever reason, I relented. I watched myself go around to the back door, consoled only by my insistence that they'd enter through the back door with me. Entering the club on such terms was a fateful decision. Whatever I drank that night made me violently ill. My head was spinning all night, and my churning stomach urged me to leave a token of my indignity all over the understated interiors of the club's game room. I managed to hold myself together long enough to stomp loudly down the stairs and out the front door, slamming it violently in hopes that it would break. Back in my dorm, I made a deal with the universe that if the room would just stop spinning, I would never, ever come close to imbibing what I consumed that night, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Perhaps because my humiliation that night was punctuated by physical illness, my resistance to asymmetrical solidarities is now fully reflexive. I cannot bring myself to ride and die for politics that won't ride and die for me. I've been called a public intellectual because I fashioned some words you may have heard about, like intersectionality and critical race theory. But if your vision of an intellectual brings to mind the thinker's pose, one with chin in hand who ponders abstract ideas, and with a light bulb suddenly flashing overhead, writes down her epiphany. That's not me at all. My thinking starts from the bottom up, from interactions with people and experiences across my entire life that have made me feel some type of way. It's a feeling that tells me to pay attention, to ask some questions, and to struggle to put into words something that needs to be said. That's what these stories are. Memory is, of course, faulty, and perspective further shades what any of us can reliably recall. I've been aided in reconstructing these stories by the faded handwriting in my childhood diaries, by the loopy cursive in my bank of journals, by the yellowed clippings and scratchy recordings about events that I've been part of, and by walks down memory lane with many companions who are part of this journey. In the end, this book is not an argument, a treatise, or a defense of my life's work, but rather a set of stories about how I make sense of the life I've lived and the thinking that life has inspired. The Fly Club episode has become my lodestar, the encounter that navigates my thinking, that disciplines my desire to be desired or to be part of the club, to be the belle of the ball. But there are times when I walk by many of the Fly Clubs in my mind's eye that I catch a glimpse of my wannabe alter ego, the one who never regretted going through that back door and has had many a great time being toasted by those who offered only conditional inclusion. As I gaze into the window of that alternate reality, feeling a momentary flight of indecision, I sometimes wonder whether the costs of backtalking are worth remaining on the outside looking in. And then my stomach churns, and I remember that the drinks in there suck anyway.
We were talking right before we went on, and there's a coda with respect to the Fly Club. Do you want to share what happened recently?
Yeah. So I was at Harvard 2 days ago, and a colleague of mine and I were walking around, and we decided, let's go check out the Fly Club, see if it sort of looks like I remember, with the front door, with the big knocker, and the back door. So we go to the Fly Club, and there it is, sitting there on Holyoke Street. Big door. And my colleague who's recording us says, why don't you walk around to the back door? And I kind of didn't want to, because it turned out that I still felt a way about it. But we were recording, and I said, okay, let's go. Let's take the viewer through something that they may have read. So I go around to the back door, and it's exactly as I remembered it. I kind of act like I'm trying to go in the back door. And I was like, okay, we're done. We can leave. So we come back around, and as we are ourselves approaching the front door, a young black guy comes up. Not the kind of black guy that the first black guy was that entered, but, really culturally fully adorned in blackness, shall we say. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll talk to this guy. So he comes rolling up, and I said, hey, are you a member of this club? And he said, yeah. I was a little surprised. I said, so, hey, can I ask you something? He goes, what? And I was like, does the club still make women go around to the back door? He shut down immediately, turned on his heels, walked right up the steps, waved his little card, went through the door, bam. And so I kind of felt away. I was surprised that I felt away, because this happened 40 years ago. So why am I still feeling something about this daggone club? And so then it's like, well, you know what? I'm going to get an answer to this. I want them, to tell me what's really going on. So we step up to the door and I buzzer, right? Standing there, trigger position, waiting for the person to come out. And, the door flings open, and the guy standing behind the door, he's in the official, I'm not letting you in position. He said, what can I do for you? And I was like, I just had a policy question. Do you guys still make women go around to the back door? And he said, this is a club for guests only. Yes, I understand that, but that wasn't the question. The question is, do you still make women go around the back door? He said, this is a private club. Slam the door. And so there are a couple things here, right? So number one, Harvard at this very moment is going about shutting down all of the things that had been policy for the prior 30 years, 40 years to make room in this traditionally white male institution for those of us who are not. That stuff is being dismantled as we speak. Yet this building that's been there for a century still doesn't let women walk through the front door. So there's that contradiction that I was grappling with. The other thing I was grappling with was, you could have a policy that's deeply sexist, but your explanation for that policy could be, I respect the question, understand why you might feel that way. This is our policy. Sorry if it offends. It was not that. It was, we don't have to say anything to you. We don't have to acknowledge your humanity. I felt like I was gum on the bottom of their shoe. And for someone who I would have included in the great we that I talk about a lot in the book, to be so dismissive of me as a human, as a Black person, as a woman, heck, as his elder, I was like, what the heck? So oddly enough, what started as a little bit of a, let's go check it out, ended up like kind of being a cloud over the rest of my time there. So I don't know, I guess there's no moral of the story other than they still do that thing there. And I'm still bothered by that. So I'm probably going to be telling this story for another 30 years.
Right, and but isn't there? I feel like one moral from the story is, and you said this when we were having dinner, right? That there are types of discrimination that in this new environment we call it neutral. Yes. It's like been grandfathered in, and so the Flag Club, we just pretend that that's not sex discrimination, yeah. Right? And instead, sex discrimination is having a women's space on campus, yeah. Right? Having an African American studies dorm, which is segregation, right? So what the Trump administration has done is flip the script so that the only discrimination that they talk about now is spaces that are trying to support people who've been marginalized. Mm-hmm. And the conversation about the old school discrimination, which still exists, is just erased as a thing, yeah. Right? That we just pretend it doesn't exist. Right. And we don't answer the question, right?
And I know we're going to get to this, but I mean, this writ large is what's happening in Louisiana. It's what's happening in Alabama. When the status quo is rendered unremarkable, just the way things are, neutral, the race and the gender power that is constituted out of and that it reinforces and insulates is not seen as a project. The efforts to remedy that, to deal with the distributional consequences of that, that's seen as the race moment. So if you look, and I know you've got much more to say about the case, but one of the things that strikes me about Calais, this is the voting rights case that the Supreme Court used to basically gut the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, 2 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago. What they are saying is that cracking black voters in order to support incumbency is a race-neutral policy. Dealing with the consequences of this long history of vote disenfranchisement by actually trying to create safe districts, that's the moment of racial discrimination. So if your baseline is neutrally framed as being perfectly consistent with the Constitution, even though it is a racialized project, how can you think about incumbency in Louisiana without understanding that it is a product of racial power, especially if you take into account how Louisiana became Republican in 5 decades, right? It's a racial story. But when it's erased, the only race is the people of color who are demanding the ability to elect someone of their choice. So that is writ large what is happening across the entire constitutional terrain. It has the effect of shoring up racial power, gender power, and making it that much more difficult to dismantle and redistribute that power.
100%. And I know you said it's not an argument, it's just stories.
Yes.
But I think there might be an argument interwoven with those stories. And I'm actually quite excited about having my students read some of these stories next to your articles, your legal arguments, and sort of seeing the relationship between them. It's like the backstory, the origin story of these powerful concepts. I did want to ask you how you made that transition, because I was surprised, with the first 150 pages or so, like before you go to law school, it's very personal, it's very family-based. And so how did you make that turn from I'm arguing with courts to I'm telling stories about my mom and my brother and my dad in Canton, Ohio?
There are two kind of origin stories here that, not too surprisingly, overlap. So the first was these stories were initially written as introductions to the law review articles. So I had, this patient editor at another press who has been expecting this collection of law review articles forever, long time. And I couldn't bring myself to just throw the articles into a text and just offer them up to the world, in part because so much has happened since these articles have been written. The uptake of the ideas and its application to a range of issues just made it seem like going to a party with your own boombox. Like, you wouldn't do that, right? You would try to dance to the music that's, everyone else is dancing to. So I had to figure out a way to think about publishing these articles that did something more than just say, here they are. So I was initially writing these stories as contextual information about what was going on in the culture, what was going on in feminism, what was going on, in the Black community, what was going on in my life that I was thinking about that led to these articles. And I had the occasion to meet an agent who was interested in seeing how I wrote outside of the sort of framework of law stuff. And I said, well, I'll let you see this book that I'm about to publish on X and X Press. It's got all these stories in front of the articles. So I sent it to him, and 24 hours later, he was on the phone saying, if you put all these stories in a book that 300 people are going to read, you're out of your mind. So he lobbied me to rip them out of the text that they were in, which it felt so violent to me. I just didn't really want to do it. But, he said, if you want to reach a broader audience, this is the kind of material that will allow people to understand, what you're doing. So that's sort of origin story number one. And when the book was sold, we were in the middle of the George Floyd moment, and people were really using these concepts. They were crossing a lot of boundaries, and so I think the publisher was of the mind that, okay, this is the book for the moment. And then a funny thing happened. It's called retrenchment, and people were making critical race theory and intersectionality the convenient Trojan horse, which I say brought white Christian nationalism to the center of American politics, all wrapped up in these concepts. The painful part of it is that not only were the concepts, I think, gentrified, occupied, hostilely taken over by meaning that had nothing to do with what any of us thought these ideas were, but stakeholders, people who we were writing about and writing for, were being brought into the conversation through a distorted lens, which made a lot of the folks in our community wonder, well, why should we defend any of this stuff? Or isn't it true that it's divisive? Or isn't it true that it's un-American? And that was shocking to me. I mean, I thought it was fairly clear that what we do is translate the lived experiences that we had into rhetorics and discourses that speak to others in power. So being a Black intellectual isn't about discovering stuff. It's basically a process of interpretation, translating, creating effective interfacing between our experience and the legal structures and other decisional structures that have the power to make decisions about our lives. That's why we do what we do. And so when this work got framed as un-American or a foreign import, first as though we needed somebody else to think our thoughts, which was insulting, but the effort to project outside of the U.S. the origins of these ideas was, a bridge too far for me. That is denial. And for me, the best response to that is to say these experiences are as American as apple pie, from the consequences of urban renewal to the concentration of Black people in toxic environments to the limited way in which integration actually constituted racial equity as opposed to all the other things that we know go on in integrated institutions. So rather than having a fight about this in an abstract or say, this sure is American, tell the story that is clearly recognizable to millions of people who live that story or who heard about that story or are living in the shadow of that story. So it's my way of saying the thoughts that I am thinking came from these specific kinds of experiences in this specific country, in this specific body. So that is the sort of clapback, I guess, to the effort to distort our work.
I love that because I think one of the most disturbing things about the way that intersectionality has traveled is the distortions where people will talk about intersectionality and I don't recognize what they're talking about. And to give you one example, I emailed you when this happened. In 2017, I was in this Black Europe summer school course, and it's taught by Black faculty. And one of the lecturers is a Black male professor who is saying that intersectionality is used by white lesbians to deny anti-racist policies, to take race out of policies by saying we want in on that as well. And okay, right? And so I'm emailing Kim saying like, wait, this brother is saying that white lesbians created intersectionality, right? And then I had to do my back-talking moment and raise my hand. I was a student, right? And say, do you know who Kimberlé Crenshaw is? She's black, right? Things that you wouldn't think you'd have to say, right? But again, the stories, the way that it's traveled, the distortions are outrageous, where it's just, you don't even know what they're talking about, right? So I do think it's brilliant to tell your stories. Also, there are people, the way that the distortion happens is a lot of those folks will never read law review articles. Right? They're long, they're dense, they're not the most accessible, right? But this is much more open, much more accessible, much more relatable. And so somebody will read that now that it's on the New York Times bestsellers list. Like, it's going to transform, because ordinary folks will read it and will understand it, and they can read it for themselves instead of having somebody else tell them intersectionality is anti-white, or all those sort of other ridiculous things that are just not true, that you're speaking for yourself and you have an audience that can read that without some intermediary distorting the narrative.
And you know, it's grounding for me. You know, I mean, I know that the stuff that they're writing is not true, but sometimes people will actually say they'll write something and put quotes around it as though I actually said it. You know, and I've had moments where I thought, did I say that? Like, hell no, I didn't say it. You know, but you kind of need to get re-immersed in your history, revisit some of these moments, uncover layers of things that I know I remember, but perhaps the meaning, the full appreciation of it is still a discovery for me. You know, I write a lot about some of the private tragedies that I had and that my mom, you know, suffered. And it was only in the last year of editing the book that I realized, you know what, there is a direct line between my watching my mom deal with trauma and my commitment to the mothers of Say Her Name. Like, you know, realizing that there's not a lot we can do to bring the women back. But one of the worst things about losing a child, especially a child to police violence, is the loss of the loss. The fact that, you know, some of the mothers are not seen in the movement because the child they lost was a woman or a girl. And the framework for the movement against anti-Black police violence predisposes people to be responsive to men and boys who are killed and just not know what to do about the women. And so seeing that double loss and knowing that actually we can do something about that, I didn't realize how much that was probably shaped by, you know, wishing that somebody would come and administer to us, administer to my mom. So there's always discoveries in your own history. And that was part of the, I won't say it was fun, it was revelatory. And it suggested there are always ways that you can continue to mine your life for knowledge and for wisdom.
Yeah, just to underscore that, if you don't know, you have, through the Say Her Name movement, created this network of mothers of the movement, right? And I remember years ago when you started doing that, I remember thinking like, wait, she's like organizing with an in-deep community with moms that are grieving and suffering, and thinking like, I would feel so out of my depth to try to do that. I feel safe when it's me and my laptop writing in my ivory tower, right? And you're in addition to doing all of that, you're in the hotel, in the hospital, right? When somebody's dying. Like, I was just really struck with those passages at how embedded you are in their lives. And it makes sense, right, that your own experience with grief prepared you to be in that space and to know how to hold that space, which is beautiful. I wanted to talk a little bit about the chapter that really just, and you let me read an early draft of it, I think back in 24, and yet again, it just really blew my mind in terms of talking about the story of Boyfriend from Hell. which maybe you can give them a little snapshot of that because they may not have all read the book yet. But I thought one of the things that's so interesting is that the distortion, one of the key distortions of intersectionality is that it's only about Black women and sort of portraying Black people and Black women in a monolithic fashion, right? That all Black women are virtuous and, let's create a seat at the table for Black women, and that's all intersectionality is, which is so reductive and misleading. And your story about Boyfriend from Hell and the Black community's reaction to that shatters, complicates that reduction, right? And so I'd love to hear more about that, and then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah. So, BFH, I don't name him for obvious reasons. It's a chapter about how I survived an effort of an ex-boyfriend to throw me through a window. And in typical fashion of violent men, this happened when the relationship was over, and I was moving on. And so I recount the story of what happened and my mother's anguish about potentially losing another child, and her effort to will me through this really difficult situation. But the situation was made difficult not just by Boyfriend from Hell, but by the institution, which was Cornell University, that, like many other institutions, saw violence between intimates as a private matter and not one that implicated any other set of issues. And they were prepared to pursue that until they learned that Boyfriend from Hell had a weapon on campus. He thought himself to be revolutionary. So when they came for us, he was going to be armed. I'm like, what you going to do with anyway. It was that type of situation. And so when they discovered that he had this weapon, then they were very interested in taking my statement and providing protection to the degree that I was willing to cooperate with them. And so he was arrested. There was some backdoor negotiation between my people and his people to tell him to get rid of the weapon because they were going to come. And the last thing I wanted was for there to be one of those shootouts. And so they were never able to recover it, which was something they actually held against me. But in the interim, I received a visit from someone, Black woman, who I admired greatly. I kind of, I wanted to be like her. People were trying to be like Mike. I wanted to be like her. She was political. She, natural everything. This was like my idol. And so when she came to see me, I thought she was coming to administer to me, as a young Black woman who was going through this horrible thing on campus. And I also have to say that culturally in the community, I didn't get a lot of support from almost anybody, especially from a lot of the women. There was, a rumor that, number one, I had probably brought it on myself by talking too much. That probably was true. I mean, I was talking, I was not backing down and doing what he wanted to do. That didn't make it right. it didn't justify it. But to a lot of women, if you had agency in any sort and said something that made him mad, then yeah, you the problem. So there was that, and then there were others who were like, oh, she's just a angry woman who wants to have him deported and break him up with his new girlfriend. It was all kinds of stuff, but it was all woman based. There are many different stories, but none of them were he's crazy, or none of them were he was jealous. I mean, there is a gender dynamic to the story that gets told about tragedies like this. I think we saw some of that happening just last month with the lieutenant governor who killed his wife and himself. Many of the stories are stories about his pressure, his stress, and very little about her. So I saw that from that moment. So when she came, I was like, thank God, somebody who sees me, someone who's going to administer to me, someone who's going to stand up for me. And at the end of the day, what she wanted to persuade me to do was to drop the charges and to trust that the community, we, would be able to handle this ourselves. And I wanted to believe that. I knew that the police didn't care about me. I knew that the university they showed they didn't care about me. And so I believed that the promise was a reliable promise. I wanted to. So we went down, I had this meeting with him, and, it was a typical, I didn't mean to hurt you, I'm so sorry, all the kinds of stuff that men say when they're in a cycle of violence. I didn't know that then. So we went down, I dropped the charges. The prosecutor was angry. He was like, have you thought about what's going to happen when he comes for you with his weapon? I hadn't. It was a good point. But again, I believe. So long, short, he eventually got himself into some trouble with a woman who wanted him to beat up her boyfriend because he had been violent, and my ex was calling me for support. And I'm like, I'm done. I don't have anything to do with that. And that, of course, brought out the violent stalker again. So when he started stalking me, I called her up and I was like, where's the community? I really need your support. I think I never spoke to her again because she didn't pick up the phone, didn't call me back. I kind of tried to find out where this was happening. At the end of the day, I had to rely on a different group of men. Not all of them, most of them didn't share my politics. Not all of them were Black, but they cared about me. And they escorted me to my classes, to my job, to the cafeteria until I could actually get out of there, with my life. And so I always wondered, why did you disappear? Why were you unable to do what you said? And so we did have an occasion where I found out that, she lived nearby and we got together.
Years later, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Years later. 25 years later. And we have a great time when we get together, just like I remembered, we remembered minutia from, that class when Dr. Turner did such and such and so and so. So it was really a trip down memory lane. And so when I finally shifted the conversation to ask, why did you disappear? Why did you not support me? She said she didn't remember. And then I struggle, and I still do. What is the cut that's the deepest? Is it that it was so insignificant to her, that I was so insignificant to her, that something that almost ended my life just didn't register. Or she remembered, but didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to acknowledge and be held even momentarily accountable. I don't know which one it is, but, as I end the chapter, I know that the kind of sisterhood that I want is not that.
Yeah.
Not that.
Yeah.
And that's a struggle that we're still having as a community.
Yeah, and I feel like I shared with you also over dinner, I have had at least 2 Black women students who wrote papers in my class about being stalked by Black men who had mental illness. And this is, 2020, that time when we're talking about the police and the precarity that Black people are experiencing when you call the police. And so they told Black friends, Black classmates, Black male classmates, this guy is stalking me, like I can't leave my apartment, right? And their response was, just don't call the police. And I think like that even today, right, post Me Too, post the racial uprising, the instinct of a lot of people in the Black community is to rally around the Black man, to protect the Black man, that these brothers didn't feel responsible to help her be safe, right? And so we look, I'm all in favor of abolishing the police, but we need to have a system in place, right, to protect people, because there still is violence. And to say to Black women, you're on your own. But then I think you're saying also the deepest cut is that this is a Black woman who herself was subject to the same risk of violence. And for her to not remember and to not pick up the phone after promising the community would have your back. So I asked you, what would you tell my dear niece, Kennedy, who is a sophomore at Spelman, a Black women's college, right? Like, how did that shift your thinking about assumptions about solidarity and, who's going to have your back when you need them?
So, I wrote the book with a very strong foregrounding of the notion of a we. And many of these moments are moments when the failure of the we, forced me to rethink not just the assumption, but the why of the failure, and what to say about the failure, what to think about the failure. So what I would say, first of all, is that the first we that you are most responsible for is the me, right? You have to be responsible to yourself, to your well-being. And that's saying a lot, because if you want to be down, right? You want to be a movement sister. Movement sisters are used to sacrificing, used to being the helpmates, used to being the ones who, do the work in the back so that, other people can shine. And frankly, to be honest, one of the reasons why I think the readiness to believe that maybe I brought it on myself is that I wasn't one of those sisters. Like, when we were organizing the conference, and, there's this discussion in there where, I'm going to pick up the speaker and the other women want me to make the Kool-Aid. And I'm like, I'm not making the Kool-Aid. And it's like, well, why aren't you making the Kool-Aid, right? And so there are ways that we internalize the gender roles that have been put upon us, and then we judge each other by the extent to which we will or will not take that on. And so I think that general sense of to be down means that you self-sacrifice is really a gendered dimension of racial solidarity politics that has to be interrogated and rejected. So a lot of that starts inside, which is number one. And then, I say this pretty much about everything. You need a posse, but that posse also needs to be tested. I mean, it can't just be we girls, and then something bad happens and you look around and they're not there, So I'm all about having connections that are articulable, not just in terms of a common cultural identity, but understanding that there are politics involved in the notion of solidarity. And you need to know where your sisters are going to stand on stuff.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just to underscore one point that I think you made, I think people in any particular marginalized group, how we negotiate power, how we relate to power, whether we backtalk, whether we try to accommodate, whether we make the Kool-Aid, right? Like I feel like on faculties, right? You know, I can tell you a story about the Black folks on my faculty and the ways we interact with power, right? And there's a range. And I think what I've learned to look for is, okay, who's willing to backtalk? Who's willing to pay some price for resisting, right? Because there will always be brothers and sisters that are more interested in keeping the peace and not being seen as difficult. And, you know, they'll tell you in private they agree with you, but they ain't trying to say that to the dean, right? You know? And so I do think my lesson to the people in the room, especially the young folks, my niece, right, is like pay attention to how the people that you think that start off with an assumption that they're on your side, how do they relate to power, right? Because that will tell you who's going to be there and who's going to look the other way and not take your call when you need them, right?
And just to underscore what you said, you can't tell it by what people write.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there.
Right. You know what she's saying. Right. I think we may be running short on time, but I want to make sure to get this question in because our work has overlapped again in recent years. I want to go back to 2020, and it's Fox News. Chris Rufo, I don't know if you all know that name, appears and talks about critical race theory. And within weeks, Trump signs an executive order that supposedly bans CRT. Now, they don't even know what CRT is. They think CRT is telling white people that they're inherently racist, things that are not part of CRT, right? But like they claim that they've banned CRT. And then you have springing up in dozens of states laws that ban divisive concepts. And part of this also eventually is the don't say gay law in Florida, right? We can't talk to kids about sexual orientation, about gender identity. And this sweeps the red states. And so when it begins with CRT, you're ringing the alarm, telling people our allies, our friends, or so we thought, right? That this is a crisis for democracy. And they're not taking your call. And then we end up in a place today where it's not just CRT, it's banning books. It's universities, again, shutting down the Women's Center, abandoning DEI, all the websites that were scrubbed. Remember when they used to have all those smiling brown faces on the websites, and now that's all gone, right? And so how did we get from 2020 to 2026?
Yeah. So I could sum it up with cowardice, but let me back up a little bit and talk about a tale of two movements, right? So you've got the Christopher Rufos. You've got, obviously, the Trumps. You've got a well-organized, extraordinarily well-financed, small group of people who exercise sized influence in American politics. They are the MAGA wing that has now taken over, pretty much everything right of center and the center, is on brand. I mean, I have mad respect for the fact that they said something crazy. We want to go back to the time before most of y'all had any rights, before the civil rights, laws were on the books, before you were in colleges and universities, before you could do anything other, than cart garbage and clean homes. We thought that was the good old days. So they set it out there, and then they went systematically about creating the conditions under which that idea could seem reasonable. So, what do you have to do to make the 1950s appear to be a place where anyone would want to go to? You got to erase history. What do you have to do in order to enforce a ban on the kind of ideas that gave rise to the civil rights movement? You go to the libraries and you take out those books. What do you do if you want to set the terms of existing hierarchy as natural and defensible? Well, you take out books in the Naval Academy like I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings or How Racism Takes Place. You take that stuff out. What you leave is Charles Murray, The Bell Curve, that essentially, asserts that there's a natural racial hierarchy. It's all about intellect, and black people are at the bottom of it. Or worse still, you leave Adolf Hitler on the shelves. Mein Kampf, you can still read that. You can't read anti-racism, but you can read racism, right? So they are on brand. They are frame aligned. They have, a propaganda machine that is unparalleled. And they also have the participation of the accommodators, the pivoters, just give them this and they'll go away. And those aren't the MAGA people, but they are institutions that give MAGA power by allowing them to have a heckler's veto. So where we overlap in particular is in a moment when the College Board was creating an African American Studies program, and of 4 of the key themes, one of them was intersectionality, one was Black queer theory, the other one was structural racism. They were like, these are some of the key concepts through which to understand the African American experience. Everyone agrees to this until it goes to Florida. And Ron DeSantis comes up with this chart that has all of these names and all these ideas with a red line drawn through them. And this red line basically means that if you're including this content in our African American Studies course, it will not be taught here. We're not going to let you teach it. Now, here's where it gets kind of funky. The College Board is a billion-dollar organization. They get that money by selling these courses to highly populated states with a lot of students. Losing Florida doesn't work with their economic plan. So what are they going to do when you got a governor saying these concepts can't be taught? You consider yourself a gateway institution all about higher education, but you also have this economic threat. What they did was they eventually said, okay, we're not going to teach this stuff. Now, did they say we're not going to teach it because of pressure? No. Did they confess that at the end of the day, what they're about is the economics of what they're doing rather than the pursuit of knowledge? No. What they said was intersectionality is no longer a useful concept. What they said was it's been so highly politicized that it doesn't make sense to even try to teach it anymore. Well, who decided that it wasn't effective? Who's been doing the politicizing? It basically allows a very small group to say, we're going to veto the stuff we don't like. We're going to tell lies about the stuff we don't like. And we're going to count on the mainstream media to say, oh, that's too hot or that's controversial. And by that measure, the mainstream ends up underwriting a far-right strategy. That's how this stuff has come to the center of American politics, right? So when you say, how did we get to 2026? We got here, number one, because there was a recognition that these concepts that people were talking about and mobilizing about. Never forget, 2020 was the largest mass protest that ever happened in American history, ever. they were deeply disturbed by that. And so they go after the terms and the frameworks, thinking that that will destabilize the movement, which in many ways it did. And then you've got, law firms, universities, and foundations also kissing the ring. And that's how we get to 2026 with again, a minority of the population. But, in all moments when societies have fallen into fascism, it hasn't just been the overwhelming party of power. It's been the agreement of others not to fight it.
I think that's been what's so shocking to me, and maybe I was naive at just seeing how liberal institutions just folded one right after another, and they know it's wrong and they don't agree, but the fear overwhelmed any other emotion, right? And that, the lawyers will tell them, you can still do this, you still have the First Amendment, but they're like, oh, it's not worth it, right? They're willing to capitulate because they just want to escape the wrath of this autocrat. Okay, I'm going to ask some of the questions that people have given us. And this one is asking, how do you balance, or how have you learned to process the emotions or emotional attachment to traumatic experiences in order to do the work that you have done?
I can't say I've necessarily done that. Either I'm working with it, working through it, or it is the fuel. But I wouldn't say that it's over here, or I had to do this in order to do the work. I say earlier in the book that my work does start with a feeling about something. When I say I feel a way about something, I mean that, right? I feel a way about something, and then I have to interrogate and ask myself, what is it about this thing? And it's putting words to that becomes the moment that's called theorization, but I call making it articulable, making the reaction articulable. And some of that reaction is, the first story I tell is a trauma that I experienced at 5. I still feel that thing, right? I really do. But now I have words to tell me why I felt that way. I have words to tell me why what happened is inconsistent with, notions of equity and justice. Where I have the harder time, honestly, is when I don't have the words to express or to capture an experience. That scares me the most too. Like when something is happening and it's clearly, in my view, injustice, but I don't have, and it's unjust because this, that, and that. If I can't put it together, that bothers me. So I spend a lot of time trying to tell myself, what is the argument here? And a lot of times, we don't have the benefit of all of the assumptions about normalcy and the status quo and all that we can jump off of. We've got to sometimes dig deeper to be able to articulate in a reasonable, understandable, and legible way where the injustice is in circumstances and dynamics that most people have taken for granted.
And I feel like we're very similar that way, in that our scholarship emerges from our experiences with discrimination. And there's something about when you know it's wrong, but you can't articulate it, that it's like it, but it's productive that, like, I'll spend months trying to understand it.
Yeah.
And then a year later, I've written something about it. But we obviously are blessed to have a job that gives us the time, and that, writing about our experiences actually is like part of our job, right? But I think the hope, and what I felt in reading your book, and what I think people in the audience would also experience as well, is that in reading about your experiences, they see glimpses of their own experiences and a new way of understanding those experiences, right? And so it's not just about you, and it's the we, honestly, that you see yourself in some of those experiences, and it can be quite powerful and I think cathartic. Okay, another question. I heard you speak at InCore a few years ago, and you warned us about Project 2025. Do you think this administration will try and attempt to do all that was in those 900 pages?
Yes. Yes. It was not hyperbole. It was a wish list. I actually think, honestly, that they probably are surprised about how successful they've been. You know, because you probably think, okay, we're gonna roll into town and we're gonna do this and that, and somebody's like, yeah, but it's not gonna be that easy. You know, there's gonna be resistance. You know, we can't just drive the tank into the middle of the town square. And I think that, you know, either because they had convinced themselves that, you know, the whole country, you know, is implacably opposed to all of their craziness, that there would be more resistance. I think that they probably would not have anticipated how quickly, let's say, the main blue law firms that had fought the Trump administration, Trump won, they had to think that they had some fight in them, especially since this stuff, a lot of stuff was patently illegal, which has turned out to be the case. You know, so yes, I think they have every intention of trying to do everything, if not more. That's what they're talking about. And in the meantime, what's the other side doing?
Well, and that's a good opportunity to ask, and I'm going to give credit to my colleague Jonathan Glader, who says we need to be dreaming up. What are we going to do? When we get into we're playing defense, we're keeping our head down, we're capitulating, many of us, but like this is when we should be dreaming the next phase, right? It's not just let's go back to say 2022, let's go forward.
So the principal complaint that I have with how we're responding is that there's some who believe we can't afford to dream, and there's certain things we can't afford to fight about anymore. And a lot of that is racial injustice. So, you know, I go, you know, to the marches and look around and see what's on the signs. I see a lot of things on the signs, but there are a lot of things I don't see on the signs. So I don't see a defense of, you know, the vision of a true multiracial inclusive democracy. You know, I see, you know, obviously fight ICE. I even see defend NATO. But I don't see, and I'm sure the next protest will have it. But the Voting Rights Act has been in trouble for a decade. I don't see signs like that. And I don't see signs against anti-Blackness. So when I've talked to people about it, you know, what I'll get is, well, we have to activate the ideas and the demands that will bring more people to the movement. And race, unfortunately, is just not that. That just means that the Achilles heel of this democracy is continuing to be the Achilles heel. This faction has broken this country in the past rather than share it with those that they consider to be racially inferior. And we are on track for the same thing to happen again. You don't defeat that by not talking about it. You can't win an asymmetrical war. So when they're throwing, you know, the equivalent of atomic bombs into our democracy, like they're doing in Louisiana, and daring us to say anything about it, it's a recognition of the fact that they know that we're weak on that. We're not standing together on the history that brought us this far. We're not willing to say that the fears of replacement and the resentments post-Obama are a driving force in deteriorating, this democracy. We're not willing to say that. And when an opponent knows what your weak side is, they're going to pummel it. And so the idea that, we're not going to talk about this, it's going to go away, it was the opposite. Not talking about it's guaranteed that that's where they were going to come, and they were going to come hard. And I'm not sure if there's a we yet that is a majority that opposes this stuff and is willing to speak to the way that our democracy is being ripped apart in not a very different way than it was ripped apart during the Civil War.
Yeah. This may be our last question. I got to check time. How can I help counter the anti-CRT movement?
Read. Challenge people who don't read. And lift up your own racial literacy, because, look, there's the CRT that Russell and I do, the articles that we write, the cases that we unpack, the ways we grumble with each other about the bullshit in it, and that's our job. But what they're going after is really not what Russell and I are doing. What they are going after is any racial literacy whatsoever. What they're going after is any idea that there are inequalities today that are continuously reproduced. What they're going after is any acknowledgement of a past that has created these conditions. So if you actually read what the moms of liberty don't want their kids to learn, it's not Crenshaw and Russell. They're talking about why do they have to learn about Ruby Bridges, who was a 6-year-old black girl who integrated the public schools in New Orleans in the 50s and had to be escorted to school by by federal marshals. They don't want their kids to learn that. They don't want their kids to learn about the Montgomery bus boycott. We can talk about Rosa Parks not wanting to give up her seat, but we don't want to talk about why she was forced to give up her seat. We don't want to talk about or use the words white supremacy or racist. We don't want to talk about the Tulsa race riot. What is the Tulsa race riot if we're not going to call it a race riot, right? So they're trying to whitewash history to render the population ignorant about the racial power that established this social order. That's how you make it natural and just there, or even build in the inference that inequality is a feature of the people, not a feature of the society that produced it. The best way to do that is to erase all literacy. And let's be clear, making people illiterate is what they've always tried to do in order to maintain racial hierarchy. This is just this generation's version of it. So when I help people think through what they're going after with critical race theory, I sometimes say I want everybody to stand and I'm going to figure out who the critical race theory people are, because you guys apparently are the problem. And I say, you'll have an A answer or a B answer to each of these vignettes. And if you answer A, you are not a critical race theorist. If you're answering B, you are the people that they're trying to silence. And then I'll just give a bunch of scenarios that come from what we understand race to do. Like, you're a black family and you have a house appraised, and it gets appraised for $300,000 less than you think it's worth. And then you go and take out all your black pictures and all your tapestries and your art and all of that, and you bring your white neighbor in, and they put up their pictures, and it gets reappraised, and suddenly it's worth $300,000 more. Now, I'll say, if you think that it was just a clerical error, sit down. You are not a critical race theorist. You don't have to worry. But if you understand that this is exactly how wealth disparities are reproduced generation after generation, if this is evidence that markets are not race neutral, if that's how you read this, then you might have to keep standing, because maybe you're a critical race theorist. And I'll just go through other ones. Tanya has a great idea in a business meeting that solves 3 different problems. She says it, people act like she didn't say anything. Brad says the same thing 5 minutes later, and people say, that's the best thing since sliced bread. Sit down if you think that the problem is that she just didn't speak loud enough. You are not a critical nothing. But if you understand this to be the kind of implicit bias that holds marginalized people, people of color, queer people, women down, then you might be a critical thinker. And we'll just go through a few more of them. And in the end, most people are still standing. Most people are still standing. You are the people that the censors want to eliminate, because you've got knowledge about the way the world is actually working. And it doesn't turn on whether someone says, we don't like you, or we want to exclude all the people. It turns on the dynamics of race and gender power in our institutions. That's the literacy that we try to work on. That's the literacy that we try to connect up with, because you all understand this stuff, and we're just trying to put names to the understanding that you have. So I don't know if it's a good thing to say you're probably all critical race theorists. I think it's a good thing, right? And I think the way to push back is to say, you're talking about my life, or you're talking about me denying things that I know to be true. And that cannot be consistent with how I'm supposed to be and behave in something called a democracy. These 2 things don't match up, and I'm not going to force them to match up.
Excellent. One final question, which actually follows naturally from where you just ended. We do have several budding critical race theorists in this room, because at least 4 people asked some version of, how do I become a critical race professor? How do I study intersectionality? How can I get into academia? And I'll just sharpen it a little bit, that one thing that I've observed is we have some brothers and sisters in the academy that will tell entry-level professors, whatever you do, don't say you're critical race. You can study race, but don't say you're critical race, right? And we'll tell them to repackage it and to cover it and to do anything but critical race, right? So again, you kind of have to be a backtalker to pursue that route, even though the conventional advice is, anything but critical race theory.
Oh, my goodness. Well, so I'll start little to big. Little, one of the ways you can become more conversant with and just join a community, because the one thing I said earlier, I say it again, you need a posse. This is my posse right here. Because Russell will see something and send me an email. Have you seen this? And I'll go, oh my God, something else. And we'll analyze it together. We got it. You need that. Our organization, the African American Policy Forum, was founded because we knew the absence of a posse, an absence of a shared understanding about intersectionality, gave us Clarence Thomas. And Clarence Thomas gave us Citizens United, which gave us a democracy on sale, which gave us the current occupant of the White House. So it is clear to us that this work needed an institutional space, that people could feel as though they are at home, and that we can develop shared knowledge together. For the time being, the organization still stands. And for the time being, we still do summer school. And this year, our summer school is Backtalkers Academy. Backtalkers Academy. Uh, and
They can still sign up for
They
it?
can still sign up. And in fact, being here, you can get a discount because you came to this talk. And it's going to be 5 Wednesdays, beginning the last Wednesday in May. If you go to Backtalkers Academy and you graduate from that, we're going to Brian Stevenson's Legacy Museum for the last week in July. Our commitment and our belief is that we have to move away from transactional ideas around racial and social justice. We didn't get this far by making it a transactional framework. There was a moral imperative. There's no better way to reconnect with that moral imperative than going to the Legacy Museum and seeing the artifacts of that history, sitting with not just the fact of that oppression and the fact that we're actually walking on the ground of it, but the imperative that was embodied in real people who had no reason to believe that their demands would ever reach the recognition that it did, but they felt they had no choice. So Backtalkers is actually going on the road to try to recapture that. And so that's part of a community that supports graduate students, fellow Backtalkers. Russell is part of the faculty as well. I think on the bigger picture, because Russell's absolutely right. We have colleagues who, we admire and read their work, but they don't all often acknowledge and cite our work. There are many things that could be said about that, but I'll just say that our legacy that brought us here was not made up of people who were shucking and jiving. It was not made up of people who said, yes, boss. It was the ones that said, no, we're not giving up this seat. We're not giving up this vote. We're not giving up this education. We did not negotiate our way into a transformative civil rights movement, and we're not going to negotiate our way now that it's under attack. If that was not the strategy and tactic to get us here, it's definitely not going to be the strategy and tactic to protect us. My own feeling is that shucking and jiving and don't say this is part of what got us here. Is part of what got us here. I'll end on something light. There was this joke that Richard Pryor used to tell about two men who were camping, and they hear a bear outside the tent, and one of them says, "What we gonna do?" And the other one is putting on his sneakers, his running shoes. And the first one says, you can't outrun the bear. And the second one says, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. I think that is part of what some of the folks who just said, look, I just need to get away from you and, let the bear eat you. The point is that the bear is insatiable. He's not going to be satisfied eating the slow one or the one that says, I do critical race theory. As we see now, they did not end with critical race theory. They came after DEI. They came after our democracy. They are going to keep coming after us. So the idea that I just have to outrun you, that is not a solution, to our current moment. So, it's a funny way of saying something very serious. We cannot pivot our way out of this moment. The only choice we have is to stand and fight.
Thank you so much. There are books outside, and Professor Crenshaw will sign them. And there are snacks. And we hope you'll sign up for Backtalkers and be part of the community. Hope to see you online. Thanks so much, everybody.